The quiet before the storm. Before the whispers of resistance and the sharp crack of a pistol defined her existence, Hannie Schaft was a creature of the library and the lecture hall. Born in 1920 in Haarlem, she was the daughter of principled, socially conscious parents who instilled in her a deep-seated belief in equality and human dignity. By 1940, she was a promising student at the University of Amsterdam, her world delineated by legal theory, intellectual debate, and the quiet ambition of a future dedicated to upholding international law. Archival photographs from this period show a serious young woman with striking red hair, her gaze intense and thoughtful. Her contemporaries described her as introverted, even shy, but possessed of a fiery, unbending intellect when debating matters of principle. Her closest friends at university were two Jewish students, Fräulein Polak and Sonia Frank. In the relative peace of their shared studies, the three young women debated the future, blissfully unaware that for two of them, there would be none. The German invasion in May 1940 shattered this academic tranquility. Yet, the initial phase of the occupation was one of deceptive moderation. The Nazis, viewing the Dutch as a kindred Germanic people, initially employed a strategy of gradual Nazification rather than outright terror. But for Hannie, the poison was in the details. It was the no Jews allowed signs appearing in parks and cafes, the dismissal of Jewish professors, the quiet disappearance of neighbors. Her personal diaries, though lost to the war, are vividly reconstructed through the post-war accounts of her parents. They speak of a daughter consumed by a growing, helpless rage. While many Dutch citizens adopted a posture of cautious accommodation, waiting to see which way the wind would blow, Hannie's internal compass was already fixed. The economic logistics of occupation, rationing, curfews, the redirection of Dutch industry to serve the German war machine, were irritants to many, but to Hannie, they were secondary. Her focus, as documented by friends, was on the primary injustice, the systematic, legalistic dehumanization of a people. Her war did not begin with a declaration from London or a call to arms. It began in the quiet moments she realized her friends were no longer safe walking beside her on the streets of Amsterdam. Hello, listener, let me know where you're watching from. And if you don't mind subscribing to the channel and giving it a like, I'd be very pleased as the author. Enjoy listening. The Declaration of Betrayal. By early 1943, the velvet glove of the German occupation had been fully cast aside, replaced by the iron fist of the Sicherheitsdienst, SD, and the Gestapo. The deportation of Dutch Jews to transit camps like Westerbork, and from there to the death camps in Poland, had accelerated. For Hannie, this was no longer a theoretical outrage but a visceral, personal attack. Her friends, Fräulein and Sonia, were forced into hiding, their lives reduced to a desperate, clandestine existence. It was in this atmosphere of escalating terror that the occupiers delivered a decisive ultimatum to the intellectual heart of the nation. In March 1943, Arthur Seyss-Inquart, the Rijkskommissar for the occupied Netherlands, decreed that all university students must sign a loyaliteitsverklaring, a declaration of loyalty pledging allegiance to the occupation authority. This was a masterful stroke of psychological warfare. It was not a demand for active collaboration, but a test of passive submission. Signing it meant continuing one's studies, maintaining a veneer of normalcy, and avoiding immediate trouble. Refusing meant being barred from all universities, losing student privileges, and facing the threat of being conscripted for forced labor in Germany. For the German command, this was a strategic tool to sift the compliant from the defiant, to neutralize a large body of potentially troublesome young intellectuals. The response was a stunning miscalculation on their part. An overwhelming majority of Dutch students, estimated at over 85%, refused to sign. The universities effectively emptied overnight. For Hannie Schaft, there was never a moment of doubt. Signing the declaration would be a betrayal of every principle she held, a repudiation of her friends hiding in attics, and an act of complicity with murderers. Her refusal was absolute. As she later explained to her horrified but understanding parents, her legal studies had become meaningless in a world where the law itself was the instrument of crime. By refusing to sign the paper, Hannie Schaft formally ended her life as a student and, without a clear path forward, took her first definitive step into the shadows of the resistance. She had chosen her side, and in doing so, had placed herself squarely in the crosshairs of the state. From books to bullets, the call of the Rod van Verzet. Expelled from the world of academia, Hannie returned to her parents' home in Haarlem in the spring of 1943. A declassified file from the Dutch security services after the war contains a brief note on her activities during this period. Subject: J.J. Schaft returned to Haarlem. Ceased studies. Suspected of engaging in illegal activities. That suspicion was an understatement. Burning with a sense of purpose but lacking direction, she began with small acts of defiance. She stole identity cards for her Jewish friends, used her parents' home as a temporary safe house, and helped distribute illegal anti-Nazi newspapers like Het Parool and De Waarheid, The Truth. These papers were a critical logistical element of the resistance, a lifeline of uncensored information and a tool for bolstering civilian morale against the constant barrage of German propaganda. However, these clandestine acts of support felt insufficient. The news from the Eastern Front, combined with the ever-tightening noose around the Jewish population, convinced Hannie that passive resistance was a luxury the times could not afford. Through contacts, she sought out a more active role and was eventually introduced to the Rod van Verzet, RVV, the Council of Resistance. Unlike other more conservative resistance groups that focused on intelligence gathering for the Allies, the communist-affiliated RVV was deeply engaged in direct action, sabotage, arms procurement, and the targeted liquidation of high-level Dutch collaborators and German officials. Analysis of the Dutch resistance structure shows these ideological divisions were significant. The RVV's willingness to engage in political assassinations was controversial, but for Hannie, it was a pragmatic necessity. Her recruiters were initially hesitant. A shy, intellectual young woman did not fit the typical profile of a saboteur. But they profoundly underestimated the intensity of her conviction. She saw collaboration not merely as treason, but as an active participation in genocide. The Dutch policemen who helped round up Jewish families, the administrators who processed the paperwork, in her mind, they were cogs in the machinery of death, and the only way to stop the machine was to break its cogs. She accepted the path offered by the RVV without hesitation, trading her law books for a future that would be written in gunpowder and blood. The forging of a weapon. Joining the Haarlem cell of the RVV initiated a rapid and brutal transformation. Hannie Schaft, the quiet intellectual, had to be remade into an effective operative. Her training was a grim curriculum in the practicalities of urban warfare. She was taught to use a pistol, first a small 7.65mm FN Model 1910, then later the more powerful 9mm Sten gun, a simple, mass-produced submachine gun favored by resistance movements for its compact size and reliability. Archival accounts from fellow resistance members describe her initial clumsiness giving way to a cold proficiency. She learned to shoot not at paper targets, but at sandbags shaped like human torsos, a psychological conditioning to overcome the innate revulsion to killing. This was a critical aspect of her development. The biographical and human factors at play were immense. The RVV needed killers, not just idealists, and the process of creating one from the other was a psychologically perilous journey. Her technical education extended beyond firearms. She learned the art of disguise, a skill of paramount importance for someone with her distinctively recognizable red hair. She began dyeing it black, using glasses with plain lenses, and altering her posture and walk to become anonymous in a crowd. She was trained in fieldcraft, how to conduct surveillance without being detected, how to arrange clandestine meetings, and, most importantly, how to remain calm during a random document check by a German patrol or the dreaded Grün Polizei, Green Police. Every journey became a tactical exercise. The bicycle, the ubiquitous mode of Dutch transport, became her primary operational vehicle. It was silent, agile, and allowed for rapid escape through Haarlem's narrow streets where a car could not follow. Her analytical mind, once used to deconstruct legal texts, was now repurposed to analyze patrol routes, guard schedules, and the architecture of potential ambush sites. Every lesson brought her further from the woman she had been, forging her into a living weapon, a tool to be wielded by the resistance in its most dangerous work. The final test would not be on a training range, but on a city street, with a real target in her sights. The Oversteegen sisters and the Haarlem cell. The solitary, intellectual nature of Hannie's previous life was shattered when she was integrated into the core of the Haarlem RVV cell. Here, she met two figures who would become her sisters in arms, Freddie and Truus Oversteegen. If Hannie was the ideological heart of the group, the Oversteegen sisters were its street-smart soul. Barely teenagers when they joined the resistance, Freddie was just 14, Truus 16, they were already seasoned veterans by the time Hannie arrived. Their working-class, fiercely anti-fascist family had taught them the necessity of the fight from a young age. Truus, bold and artistic, and Freddie, quiet and observant, formed a formidable partnership with Hannie. Post-war interviews with the surviving Truus Oversteegen provide a vivid biographical portrait of their dynamic. She described Hannie as deadly serious and almost unnervingly principled, while her sister and she provided the practical, on-the-ground audacity. Their operational tactics were a chilling blend of youthful innocence and lethal intent. A common strategy involved one of the sisters, often the charismatic Truus, approaching a high-ranking German officer or Dutch collaborator in a bar. Flirting and feigning interest, she would suggest a walk in the woods. Lured away from safety, the target would be led into an ambush where Hannie and the other sister would be waiting with pistols drawn. This use of young women as bait was a terrifyingly effective tactic, exploiting the occupiers' perception of them as harmless and non-threatening. Their base of operations was a small workshop in Haarlem, the air thick with the smell of machine oil and fear. There, they cleaned their weapons, forged documents, and planned their missions in hushed tones. The bond between the three young women was forged in this shared crucible of extreme danger. They were more than a team, they were a family unit, bound by a purpose that superseded all else. This trinity, the intellectual, the artist, and the observer, became one of the most effective assassination squads in the Dutch resistance, a symbol of how the fight against Nazism had mobilized every segment of society, turning schoolgirls and students into judges, juries, and executioners. First blood and the staining of the soul. The theoretical acceptance of violence is a world away from its brutal reality. Hannie Schaft's moment of truth arrived in the summer of 1943. The target was Co Langendijk, a Dutch police officer and fervent collaborator who had become notorious in Haarlem for his zeal in hunting down Jews and resistance members. From an archival perspective, figures like Langendijk represent a crucial tactical problem for the resistance. They were locals who knew the terrain, the people, and the hiding places far better than any German officer. Neutralizing them was not just an act of retribution, but a strategic necessity to protect the resistance network's integrity. The plan was simple and brutally efficient, a hallmark of the Haarlem cell. Hannie and one of the Oversteegen sisters would stage a bicycle ambush on a quiet street Langendijk used on his way home. The waiting, as recalled in Truus Oversteegen's post-war testimony, was the worst part. The mundane sounds of the city, a distant church bell, the rustle of leaves, were amplified into a symphony of suspense. Hannie, her black-dyed hair tucked under a scarf, clutched the cold, hard grip of the FN 1910 pistol in her coat pocket. This was not a Sten gun for sabotage, this was a personal, close-quarters weapon. When Langendijk appeared, cycling at a leisurely pace, the world seemed to slow down. As planned, the Oversteegen sister rode past him, creating a momentary distraction. That was Hannie's cue. Pedaling hard, she drew alongside him. For a fraction of a second, their eyes met. In that instant, he was not a collaborator or a symbol, he was simply a man on a bicycle. Then, training took over. She raised the pistol, the noise of the shot shockingly loud in the quiet street. The impact threw Langendijk from his bicycle. He fell to the cobblestones in a crumpled heap. Without a second glance, Hannie pedaled away, her heart hammering against her ribs, the acrid smell of cordite in her nostrils. She had crossed a line from which there was no return. Later, back in the safe house, her comrades noted her silence. The intellectual who had debated justice in a classroom had just delivered it with a 7.65 mm bullet. The act did not bring triumph, only a cold, grim finality. She had proven she could kill, but the act had irrevocably stained her soul, a fact she would grapple with for the rest of her short life. The war on infrastructure, sabotage, and disruption. While assassinations were the most dramatic aspect of the RVV's work, the cell's strategic impact often came from a less personal form of warfare, sabotage. By late 1943, the German war machine relied heavily on the Dutch infrastructure, its railways for transporting troops and V-2 rocket components, its factories for producing war material, and its power grid for running it all. For Hannie and her cell, disrupting this logistical network was a primary objective. This required a different skill set, one that leveraged her analytical mind. A typical mission involved attacking the sprawling railway marshalling yards outside Haarlem. These operations were meticulously planned. Surveillance, sometimes lasting for weeks, would identify key junctions, signal boxes, and times when troop or munitions trains were scheduled to pass. The technology of sabotage was crude but effective. The primary tool was British-made plastic explosive, PE, often delivered in airdrops to remote fields by the RAF and collected by the resistance. Hannie learned the delicate art of assembling a charge, packing the putty-like PE against a steel rail, inserting a time pencil detonator, a metal tube containing a vial of acid that, when crushed, would eat through a retaining wire to release a striker. The analysis required was precise. Too little explosive and the rail would only bend, too much and the blast could draw unwanted attention before the train arrived. A declassified German Wehrmacht report from the period, filed under Acts of Terrorism in occupied Holland, complains bitterly of systematic and professional disruption of rail traffic in the Haarlem-Amsterdam corridor, noting delays that held up reinforcements destined for the Eastern Front. On these cold, dark nights, crawling through ditches with a satchel of explosives, Hannie was not an assassin but a combat engineer. It was a different kind of war, impersonal, technical, and aimed at the machinery of the state rather than the men who served it. For her, there was a psychological relief in this. A destroyed railway track did not have eyes that met hers in its final moment. Das Mädchen mit dem roten Haar. The effectiveness of the Haarlem cell did not go unnoticed. By the beginning of 1944, a pattern was emerging that deeply troubled the German Sicherheitsdienst, SD, headquarters in the region. Key Dutch collaborators were being eliminated with alarming frequency, and acts of sabotage were growing bolder. The SD, under the command of figures like the notorious Willy Lages in Amsterdam, began to dedicate significant resources to dismantling this particular RVV network. Through the interrogation of captured low-level couriers and the analysis of eyewitness accounts, often unreliable, but occasionally containing a crucial detail, a phantom figure began to take shape in their files. Multiple reports mentioned a young woman involved in the attacks. And one recurring, striking detail stood out. Despite attempts at disguise, witnesses occasionally caught a glimpse of vibrant red hair. The nickname was born in the sterile, smoke-filled offices of the SD, Das Mädchen mit dem roten Haar, the girl with the red hair. The archival footprint of this is chilling. A preserved German Fahndungslist, wanted list, from mid-1944, intended for internal circulation among security forces, describes an unidentified female terrorist, age 20 to 25, student type, believed to be a key operative in the Haarlem region. Distinctive feature, red hair. Her defining physical characteristic, the one she had tried so hard to conceal, had become her calling card. This development transformed Hannie's operational reality. She was no longer an anonymous face in the crowd, she was a specific, named, if only by a description, target. The danger level escalated exponentially. Every German patrol, every checkpoint, every random document inspection now carried the terrifying possibility that an observant soldier might see a stray lock of auburn hair and make the fatal connection. The hunter, the woman who had delivered death from the shadows, was now being hunted herself. The psychological pressure was immense, a constant, grinding fear that she had to suppress every time she stepped out the door. A moral abyss, the failed attack on fake Christ. The work of an assassin is one of razor-thin margins, and not every mission ended in success. One of the cell's most audacious and ultimately failed operations illustrates the immense risks and devastating moral consequences of their war. The target was fake Christ, a notoriously brutal Dutch police officer and collaborator in Haarlem, second only to Langendijk in his cruelty. The plan, hatched in February 1944, was for Hannie and her comrade Jan Boonkamp to ambush Christ on his way to the police station. The chosen weapon was a submachine gun, a clear escalation in firepower indicating the target's high value. The human factors in this operation were complex. Boonkamp was a seasoned fighter, but the plan was risky, requiring precise timing on a busy street. As Christ approached, something went wrong. Accounts differ. Some say a civilian walked into the line of fire, others that Christ sensed the trap and reacted first. Shots were exchanged in a chaotic firefight. Christ was wounded but not killed. In the ensuing mayhem, Jan Boonkamp was also hit, suffering a severe stomach wound. Hannie managed to drag him away from the immediate scene, but his injury was mortal. He was hidden in a nearby house, but his agony was too great. Knowing he would be captured and tortured for information, he gave Hannie a final, desperate order to get the address of his parents from his wallet and warn them. In a moment of profound emotional distress, Hannie complied, a grave error in operational security. The Germans found the mortally wounded Boonkamp, and under the influence of a truth serum administered before he died, he revealed not only details about the resistance but also the address of his last visitor, the home of Hannie Schaft. Though she escaped this immediate incident, the consequences were catastrophic. Christ, enraged, survived the attack. Jan, her friend and comrade, was dead. And most damningly, the Germans now had her name and address. The failed mission had unmasked her completely, forcing her to abandon her home and family forever and dive even deeper into the underground, now a fugitive with a name as well as a description. The Hunger Winter, resistance in a time of starvation. The Allied failure of Operation Market Garden in September 1944 plunged the Western Netherlands, still under German control, into a new kind of hell. In retaliation for a Dutch railway strike called to support the Allies, the German authorities imposed a total embargo on all food transports into the region. This marked the beginning of the Hunger Winter of 1944 to 1945. The economic and logistical context of the war shifted from occupation to a slow, deliberate starvation of the civilian population. The official ration dropped to below 500 calories a day. The streets of Haarlem and Amsterdam filled with skeletal figures, burning furniture for warmth and boiling tulip bulbs for a meager, bitter sustenance. This desperation had a profound impact on the resistance. On one hand, the population's hatred for the occupiers intensified, creating a fertile ground for sympathy. On the other, the grinding struggle for daily survival made active resistance a near impossibility for most, and the temptation of betrayal for a loaf of bread was ever present. For Hannie and her remaining comrades, the fight became even more stark and desperate. Their operations now often targeted food depots and ration card distribution offices, aiming to redirect supplies to the starving population and to punish the officials who profited from the black market. The biographical evidence from this period portrays Hannie as hardened, gaunt, but driven by a cold fury. The intellectual idealist was gone, burned away by violence and loss, and replaced by a pragmatic survivor fueled by an almost primal need to fight back against the force that was starving her people. A surviving RVV report details a plan she helped execute to ambush a truck carrying German confiscated grain. The mission was no longer about a distant front or abstract justice, it was about the immediate, visceral reality of a child crying from hunger. The Hunger Winter stripped the war down to its most brutal essence, and in this crucible of suffering, Hannie Schaft's resolve became absolute. She would fight until the end, no matter the cost. The psychology of the hunted. The failed attack on fake Christ in February 1944 and the subsequent deathbed confession of Jan Boonkamp fundamentally altered Hannie's existence. She was no longer a shadowy operative, she was a named fugitive with a price on her head. The Sicherheitsdienst now possessed her name, her pre-war address, and a confirmed connection to the RVV. The psychological toll of this transformation was immense. Declassified resistance protocols from the period emphasize a cardinal rule: an agent who becomes blown or compromised must immediately go deep underground, often being moved to a different city entirely. But in the constricted, starving geography of the occupied Netherlands in late 1944, there were few places left to run. Hannie remained in Haarlem, a ghost in her own city. Her life devolved into a series of clandestine moves between attics, cellars, and the back rooms of sympathetic strangers. The constant, gnawing fear was her only steady companion. This period is detailed in the post-war testimony of her surviving comrades, who described a marked change in her demeanor. The fiery intellectual debater was replaced by a quiet, hypervigilant woman. She trusted almost no one. Every footstep on the stairs, every unexpected knock at the door, could be the dreaded groom Politi. A simple trip to a drop point became a masterclass in counter-surveillance, her route a dizzying zigzag of doubled back streets and feigned window shopping. Analysis of the human factors at play shows this was a classic response to extreme, prolonged stress, a state of hyperarousal that is both a survival mechanism and a corrosive poison. It made her a difficult target to trap, but it also isolated her, fraying the bonds of trust that a resistance cell depends on. On one occasion, she was stopped at a random checkpoint. As the German soldier listlessly examined her forged identity card, she felt the familiar weight of the pistol in her bag, a cold lump of steel that could either be her salvation or her damnation. He waved her through without a second glance. She pedaled away, her legs trembling, the mask of calm composure shattering the moment she turned the corner. She was living on borrowed time, and the ticking of the clock was growing louder every day. Echoes of loss, the specter of betrayal. In the suffocating atmosphere of the occupied Netherlands, the greatest strategic threat to the resistance was not always a German patrol, but the whisper of a neighbor. The German SD cultivated a vast and insidious network of Dutch informants, known as WWII, short for Vertrouwensloot, or confidence men. Motivated by money, ideological sympathy, or coercion, these collaborators were the resistance's cancer, eating away at its cells from the inside. In August 1944, this reality was driven home with brutal force when an anonymous tip-off, a betrayal still debated by historians, led the SD to a secret annex on the Prinsengracht in Amsterdam. The 8 people hiding there, including the teenage diarist and Frank, were arrested and deported. While Hannie was not connected to this specific hiding place, the news rippled through the underground with chilling effect. It was a stark reminder that no sanctuary was truly safe. For Hannie, this event must have resonated on a deeply personal level. Her entire journey into armed resistance had been catalyzed by the persecution of her Jewish friends, Fräulein Polek and Sonja Frank, whom she had helped into hiding. The capture of the Frank family was not an isolated tragedy, it was a reaffirmation of the stakes and a symbol of the enemy she fought, a system that turned concealment and betrayal into a basic currency of survival. An analysis of the German security apparatus shows that for every armed German soldier, there were multiple pairs of local eyes and ears willing to report suspicious activity. This created an environment of pervasive paranoia. Every new face in a safe house, every courier who failed to report back, raised the terrifying possibility of compromise. Hannie's increasing isolation and suspicion were not just a personal psychological burden, they were a tactical response to a very real and ever-present threat. The story of Anne Frank was the story of her own friends, and a potent reminder that her war was not just against the uniformed occupiers, but against the quiet poison of collaboration that had seeped into the very soul of her nation. The final offensive, scorched earth and last stands. As 1945 dawned, the strategic context of the war in the Netherlands shifted dramatically. Allied armies were across the Rhine, and the final collapse of the Third Reich was no longer a question of if, but when. For the German forces and their Dutch collaborators trapped in the western part of the country, this was a time of desperate, nihilistic brutality. Their policy became one of scorched earth, destroying port facilities, flooding farmland, and executing prisoners with impunity. In response, the mission of the RVV and other resistance groups underwent a final transformation. Long-term industrial sabotage became less critical than immediate, life-saving interventions. The new priorities were threefold: protecting the civilian population from last-minute massacres, eliminating key collaborators and SD torturers before they could escape justice in the post-war chaos, and securing vital infrastructure like bridges and power stations for the imminent Allied liberation. Hannie, now a hardened combat veteran of nearly 2 years, was at the forefront of this final offensive. Her targets were no longer just symbols of the occupation, but its most sadistic enforcers. The operations grew bolder and more dangerous. Her primary weapon in these close-quarters urban encounters was often the British Sten Mk2 submachine gun. Aesthetically crude, stamped from sheet metal and notoriously prone to accidental discharge, the Sten was nonetheless a perfect tool for the resistance. It was compact enough to hide under a trench coat, fired a common 9mm pistol round, and could be broken down and reassembled in minutes. A mission from this period involved Hannie and Truus Overstegen ambushing and executing Willem Zirkzee, a Haarlem police officer who had a reputation for torturing captured resistance members. There was no hesitation, no moral debate. The intellectual reasoning of 1943 had been burned away by the hunger winter and the long list of dead comrades. Hannie had become an instrument of righteous fury, a soldier fighting the final, bloodiest battles of a war that was already won, but not yet over. The final ride, a single tactical error. Liberation was in the air. By late March 1945, the sound of Allied artillery could sometimes be heard as a faint, distant rumble on the wind. The end was tantalizingly close. It was in this atmosphere of strained hope and exhaustion that Hannie Schaft undertook her final mission on March 21, 1945. Her task was seemingly routine, to transport copies of the illegal communist newspaper De Waarheid from one safe house to another. It was a courier mission, a task she had performed countless times. But on this day, she made a single, catastrophic error in judgment, a violation of one of the most fundamental tenets of resistance fieldcraft. In the same bag that held the incriminating newspapers, she also carried her personal weapon, a 9mm FN Model 1922 pistol. The resistance rule was absolute: never carry compromising documents and a weapon at the same time. One or the other could potentially be explained away, both together was an undeniable confession of armed resistance. Why did she break this rule? Post-war analysis suggests a confluence of factors. It could have been simple exhaustion, a momentary lapse in the rigorous discipline that had kept her alive for 2 years. It could have been a sign of the increasing desperation and danger on the streets, making her feel that going unarmed for even a short distance was an unacceptable risk. Whatever the reason, it was a fatal mistake. As she bicycled through Haarlem, she was stopped at a German military checkpoint near the Spa-Arn River. Such checkpoints had become frequent as the cornered German army sought to control all movement. The search was routine until a soldier felt the hard, metallic object in her bag. He pulled out the pistol. Then, he found the stack of illegal newspapers underneath. The German arrest report, a stark and bureaucratic document, notes the discovery matter-of-factly. For the soldiers, it was just another captured terrorist. They had no idea they had just apprehended the ghost who had haunted them for over a year. For Hannie, the moment of discovery was one of cold, sickening realization. After all the gunfights, ambushes, and narrow escapes, her war was ending because of a simple, tired mistake. The silence of Cell 38. Hannie Schaft was taken to the Huis van Bewering, the main prison in Amsterdam. When her identity was confirmed, a wave of excitement passed through the SD headquarters. They had finally caught das Mädchen mit dem roten Haar. She was their highest-value resistance captive, a living encyclopedia of the RVV's structure, personnel, and safe houses in the Haarlem region. Her interrogation began immediately. Placed in solitary confinement in Cell 38, she was subjected to days of relentless questioning by experienced SD interrogators. Their techniques were a well-honed mixture of psychological manipulation and brutal physical torture. They wanted names, addresses, and plans. They believed that, as a woman, she would be easier to break. They were profoundly mistaken. Here, in the final act of her life, Hannie Schaft waged her last battle, not with a pistol, but with silence. The young woman who had been so shy she barely spoke in university tutorials now summoned an unbreakable will. Drawing on a core of principle that had been forged in the fire of 2 years of constant danger, she refused to speak. Accounts from other prisoners and guards, collected after the war for her official investigation, paint a portrait of incredible defiance. She endured beatings and mistreatment but revealed nothing that could endanger her comrades. Her legal training may have played a part, allowing her to mentally deconstruct their questions and avoid their traps. But ultimately, her resistance was born of pure conviction. She had accepted death the moment she joined the RVV, and she would not betray her cause to postpone it. The Germans had her body, a small, battered figure in a cold cell, but her mind and her secrets remained her own. The red-haired girl had become an icon of the hunt, but in her final days, she became a fortress of silence, her defiance a final act of war against the men who held her captive. A bargain of monsters. While Hannie endured her silent ordeal in Amsterdam, the world outside her cell was in its death throes. The Netherlands was on the verge of liberation. The Canadian forces were closing in, and the German command structure was disintegrating into chaos and paranoia. In this environment, a strange and informal agreement was struck between the senior German command in the Netherlands, under Arthur Seyss-Inquart, and the leaders of the Dutch government in exile, brokered through the Red Cross. The agreement was a pragmatic bargain. The Germans would cease their campaign of executions of political prisoners and resistance members, and in exchange, the Dutch resistance would refrain from acts of revenge and assassination against German officials during the final, chaotic days of the war. From a strategic perspective, this was an attempt by both sides to prevent a final, pointless bloodbath. The German leaders hoped to use it as a bargaining chip in their own eventual surrender, while the Dutch sought to save the lives of hundreds of prisoners held hostage in German-controlled prisons. This agreement, made in the first week of April 1945, should have been Hannie Schaft's salvation. As a registered political prisoner, she fell directly under the protection of this new accord. Her execution was explicitly forbidden. However, her fate became entangled with the personal vendettas of the men she had fought. Willy Leges, the SD commander in Amsterdam, and other local officials who had been relentlessly targeted by the Haarlem cell, saw her not as a political prisoner but as a common murderer and a personal enemy. Analysis of the command chain shows a clear point of friction. The high-level strategic agreement in The Hague conflicted with the ground-level desire for revenge in Amsterdam. For men like Leges, the idea that das Mädchen mit dem roten Haar, the woman who had personally helped execute their colleagues and informants, would simply walk free after the war was an intolerable insult. The accord was an inconvenience, a rule they had no intention of honoring. Hannie Schaft's life now hung in the balance, dependent not on international agreements, but on the whims of the very men whose power she had worked so hard to dismantle. The road to WWII. On April 17, 1945, just 3 weeks before the official liberation of the Netherlands, the order for Hannie Schaft's execution was given. The decision was a direct and deliberate violation of the agreement between the German command and the Dutch resistance. It was an act not of military necessity, but of pure, vindictive spite. The order came down from Willy Leges's office, driven by the fury of the local SD and their Dutch collaborators. They were determined that she would not survive the war. Late in the afternoon, Hannie was taken from her cell. She was told she was being transferred. It was a common lie, a simple cruelty to prevent resistance on the way to the execution site. She was put into the back of a German military vehicle. Her escorts were not regular soldiers, but hand-picked SD men and Dutch collaborators, the very type of men she had dedicated her life to fighting. Among them was Martin Kuiper, a Dutch policeman and infamous collaborator who had personally requested to be part of the execution detail. The vehicle drove west from Amsterdam, heading towards the coastal dunes near WWII. This location was already infamous, a desolate landscape of sand and scrub that the Germans had used as a secret execution ground throughout the war. Hundreds of Dutch resistance fighters had already been buried in unmarked mass graves there. As the car rumbled along the coastal roads, Hannie must have known where she was going. The dunes were a symbol of death. This final journey was a somber inversion of her operational life. Instead of cycling through the streets as a hunter, she was now being driven, a captive, to the place where all hunts ended. The logistics were grimly simple: a short drive, a deserted location, a quick and quiet murder far from any potential witnesses. I shoot better than you. The car stopped in a secluded hollow in the WWII dunes. The air was cold with the North Sea wind. Hannie was ordered out of the vehicle and marched a short distance over the sand. She was standing before a freshly dug, shallow grave. The moment was one of absolute finality. Her executioners were Martin Kuyper and an SD man named Emil Rule. According to post-war forensic reports and Kuyper's own later testimony, Rule fired the first shot. He was either a poor shot or deliberately cruel. His bullet only wounded her in the shoulder. Hannie stumbled but did not fall. In that moment, facing the man who had failed to kill her cleanly, the defiant, acid-tongued spirit that her comrades knew so well flared one last time. Looking directly at her executioner, she spat out her legendary final words, "Ich shoot better. I shoot better." It was a statement of breathtaking defiance. It was not a plea for mercy or a prayer, but a final, contemptuous assertion of her own competence and her enemy's inadequacy. It was the sniper critiquing the amateur, the professional soldier mocking the brutish thug. The human factor in this moment is profound. Even in the face of certain death, her identity as a fighter, as someone more skilled and more principled than her murderers, remained intact. Her words enraged Kuyper. He drew his own submachine gun and fired a burst into her back, killing her instantly. She fell into the shallow grave they had prepared. They hastily covered her body with sand and left, leaving the girl with the red hair alone in the dunes, her final act of resistance and insult that would echo through history. Her war was over. An icon unearthed. On May 5, 1945, the German forces in the Netherlands officially surrendered. Liberation, the dream that had sustained Hannie and so many others, was finally a reality. In the aftermath, a grim accounting began. The Dutch authorities launched a massive effort to locate and identify the bodies of executed resistance members, many of whom were buried in the dunes near Overveen. The search was guided by leads from locals and the interrogation of captured German and Dutch officials. On November 27, 1945, a search team, following a tip from the investigation into Martin Kuyper, located a shallow grave. Inside, they found the remains of a young woman. The red hair, though matted with sand and time, was still identifiable. Dental records confirmed what they already suspected. They had found the body of Hannie Schaft. The discovery turned the whispers of her last-minute execution into a national tragedy. She was one of the last of over 400 people to be executed at Overveen, killed in flagrant violation of an end-of-war truce, a martyr murdered on the very cusp of peace. Her story captured the public imagination. She was not a general or a politician, but a student, a young woman whose sense of justice had driven her to the ultimate sacrifice. Her reburial became a national event. On the same day she was found, her coffin was carried in a solemn procession to the Grote Kerk, the main church in her hometown of Haarlem, and laid in state. Her funeral was attended by members of the Dutch royal family, including Queen Wilhelmina, who referred to Hannie as the symbol of the resistance. The shy student had become a national icon. The German file on das Mädchen mit dem roten Haar was closed, but the archival record of her life was just beginning to be written, transformed from a police report into a legend of heroism. The legacy of a red-haired girl. The legacy of Hannie Schaft is complex and enduring. In the immediate post-war years, her story was caught in the crosscurrents of Cold War politics. Her affiliation with the communist-leaning RVV made her a problematic hero for some in the West-leaning Dutch establishment. For a time, public commemorations of her sacrifice were discouraged. However, the power of her story, the clear moral line from intellectual conviction to righteous action, could not be suppressed. By the 1970s and 80s, she was reclaimed by a new generation of activists, particularly feminists and anti-fascist groups, who saw her as a powerful symbol of female agency and uncompromising resistance. Her story was told in books, films, and documentaries, cementing her place in Dutch national memory. Her executioners faced their own reckoning. Martin Kuyper was arrested, tried for treason and murder, and executed by a Dutch firing squad in 1948. Willy Leges, the SD commander who gave the order, was sentenced to death, but his sentence was later commuted to life imprisonment on medical grounds, a decision that caused a national outcry. He was eventually released and died in Germany. From a historian's perspective, Hannie Schaft's narrative provides a powerful lens through which to analyze the very nature of resistance. It demonstrates the brutal moral compromises required when fighting a totalitarian evil, the psychological transformation of ordinary people into killers, and the incredible resilience of the human conscience. Today, at the execution site in the Overveen Dunes, a simple stone marks the place where she fell. But her true monument is the ongoing debate her life provokes, about justice, sacrifice, and what it means to fight for one's principles in a world where law has collapsed and only conviction remains. The girl with the red hair was silenced on a cold day in April 1945, but her story, a testament to the righteous fury that can burn within an ordinary heart, speaks as loudly as ever.